Hi everyone, welcome back to the garden. It's another windy day here. The clouds are absolutely racing by. Sunny one second, cloudy the next, but the birds are singing and the days are starting to drag out now. In my last video, I looked at a few of the tropical style plants that I grow here in the garden, the ones that stayed outside all winter. The Tetrapanax, the Gunnera, the Trachycarpus, all the plants now that are just starting to come into growth and how best to look after them over the next couple of months. But today I want to look at two more exotic banana style plants, the Musa Dwarf Cavendish and also Ensete ventricosum Maurelii, which has got bright red leaves and honestly is probably the start of my summer garden here. I want to look at how best to care for them over the next 6 weeks as they will be staying inside and how to get them into growth to get the biggest and best plants possible this summer. So let's get started. I finally found somewhere a little bit sheltered from the wind, but it's still a very blustery day out here today. And this plant in front of me is a Musa Dwarf Cavendish. Now, superficially, I suppose it does look similar to the Musa Bajou that I showed you last week. That wind's still raging on. But the Bajou is a plant that stays outside all year. So it's a hardy banana. It doesn't look great in winter, but it can take a lot of cold, a lot of frost, and it'll soon start growing again in spring. Whereas this Dwarf Cavendish is a tender plant. It's similar to Coleus and a lot of the other plants that we grow in summer, kind of bedding plants really for the tropical style, but this one has to be brought inside in winter. It's a plant that in theory, you'll see it as being able to take a minimum of around 10 degrees Celsius, somewhere around there anyway. What I found is at the back end of the year, in mid to late autumn, it can take a lot lower than that. It can probably take maybe even 3 or 4 degrees, but that's at the end of the season when the temperature's slowly cooled over the weeks and you've still got that warm soil, just keeping the frost off and keeping it warm. But at the start of the year, this is a plant that's been inside all winter. It's had all that warmth inside. You can't just put this outside now where there's still definitely frost going to happen and expect it to survive. So it's a plant you really need to baby at the start of the season. You need to look after it. And what I've done, this plant here is one that I bought last summer. I think it was early summertime. Then when it came to late autumn, I brought it inside. And at that point then, I just started to give it a little bit less water than it received outside. So it's always been potted, this plant, but I let it dry out ever so slightly. And that's because whenever I bring any kind of tropical plant inside for winter, I don't really want to keep them in active growth. I want to slow them down as much as possible. And that's because inside with the lower light levels, you don't really want your plants getting leggy, pushing out leaves. Otherwise the growth tends to be really soft and it's vulnerable to attack from pests. So this plant, what actually happened was some of the leaves, you can probably see here, they just start to turn a yellowy brown colour, and some of the lower leaves I had to chop off entirely. But that's perfectly normal because they're coming from a wet autumn garden, going inside where it's a lot drier, the humidity is a lot lower. But all I did is chop those leaves off and it's adjusted to the conditions inside. From then, I basically treat it like a house plant. Somewhere bright, a little bit of water every week or so, and it looks like this. And this is a plant that'll be coming outside around late May time maybe. It definitely doesn't want to catch a late frost. In terms of spring care tips then, what I'll be doing is potting up that Dwarf Cavendish in around a month or so's time, so mid-April, into a slightly larger pot. I suppose you could plant it out into your garden for summer as a kind of bedding plant, dig it up and then put it in a pot over winter purely for storage. But what I want to do, especially as it gets a bit larger, is enjoy it as a house plant. So having it in a half decent pot will make the whole thing more presentable. I should be able to enjoy it over the winter months rather than just storing it. But you could just plant it out into your garden like I say, although for either option, whether you're putting it outside in a pot or planting it out, like I said, you definitely want to wait until after the last frost for your area. Some years that can be early May, some years it can even be early to mid-June. But whenever it is, it's honestly worth being a little bit patient and not bringing it outside until then. And the crucial thing, like a lot of these tender plants you might store as houseplants over winter, is to harden it off. So practically, you don't have to be too scientific about it. What I do is put it into a polytunnel. I've got a really cheap plastic greenhouse at the minute until I get a proper greenhouse. Hopefully some news on that soon. I'll put it in there for a few days and let it acclimatise to the cooler nights, let it get a bit of draft during the days, and that way it can experience a wider range of temperatures than it's actually had inside. And then after a few days or a week or so of that, I'll put it somewhere in the garden, somewhere sheltered, somewhere shady, where those leaves can get to experience the wind and a little bit more of the actual outside world. And at that point then, it's time to move it into its final position where it can enjoy a bit more sun and really put on some growth this year. And in terms of washing and feeding, what I'll do is, while it's inside, treat it as I have been doing, a little bit of water every week, not letting it completely dry out and not flooding it either. And then as soon as it comes outside, then you can start watering and feeding at the same time. Because with bananas, they grow so rapidly, they're definitely hungry plants, they need a lot of nitrogen for those big leaves. You can give them as much as possible for the biggest amount of growth in the shortest time. And that's a plant that will really size up quickly. And excitingly, you might be thinking, why would I want to go to all this effort to grow a banana plant? The Dwarf Cavendish, not only does it look slightly different to the Bajou plants, but this one can actually produce edible fruit here in the UK. Personally, I've had one to around 2 meters tall, then it got too big for the conservatory. I couldn't overwinter it, so I never got to enjoy those fruits. But if you've got somewhere tall enough to keep it in winter, somewhere inside that's very bright, you might even get some edible bananas here in the UK. So that's definitely an exciting one. But from a plant that can potentially produce edible bananas to one that's purely ornamental, next we're looking at Ensete ventricosum Maurelii. So the next plant then, the Ensete ventricosum Maurelii. Just to explain that name a little bit, because if you're new to these tropical style plants, names can seem a little bit confusing, like a Harry Potter spell or something like that. Ensete means the type of plant that it is, it's a type of banana. Ventricosum narrows that down further, and then Maurelii is this specific variety. So in terms of Ensete, there's a few different Ensete bananas. Ventricosum is the most popular one that you can grow here in the UK. The actual plain green ventricosum isn't quite as common, still a nice plant, but for me, it's all about those red and orange leaves. They look absolutely fantastic when the sun shines through them, and that's where the Maurelii version really shines. That's one that's the most common version. I think it looks the best, got the most ornamental value, and it's also supposed to be a little bit more cold tolerant. But before I actually show you it, let's just show you what that plant looked like last year, so you can get an idea of what this beauty can actually become, and you might get a little bit shocked by what it looks like now. So as you can see, absolutely huge paddle-shaped leaves. It really looks fantastic, and it's got to be one of the #1 tropical style plants for bringing maximum impact to your garden. Everyone, no matter who they are, even if they've got experience of growing tropical style plants, will appreciate a decent sized Ensete. And now let's show you mine, or at least one of them anyway, that's been overwintered inside. And as you can see, it looks a complete mess. It's browning, some of the leaves are starting to tear off now. It's basically been dry stored, but in a pot. Most people tend to dry store these when they get to a decent size, and that's great because it means you don't have to do anything with it over winter. You just put it in your loft, somewhere that's frost free, and you just leave it alone. But what I do is actually dry store them in a pot. There's a lot more explanation on my method and why I use it in my previous video looking at overwintering. I'll put a link to that in the description below. But this Ensete, now in mid-March, it looks tatty, but it's not quite time to get it into full growth yet. Because it's a plant that grows so quickly, especially when they get to this size, the leaves can be absolutely massive, about 1.5 meters long. I don't want it getting too big for the place I got inside too quickly. All I do is, just to tidy the plant up, basically chop these leaf bases back. And that's what's left over. They can just be put into the compost or the brown bin, or whatever colour it is where you are. I just chop all around these, removing them from the plant. One thing you will notice when you're doing this is that your Ensetes have shrunk considerably since last autumn. All that water that they've lost as they've dried out, it definitely reduces their overall size and weight, but at least planting them back out is definitely a lot easier than bringing them in. So what I'll do, just chop around all these. You don't have to be too precise with this. I don't chop them back too small. What I find is if you cut them back too far, there's a chance they might rot back or dry back too far and actually take away from that trunk. Because I suppose an Ensete doesn't have a true trunk, it's literally just made up of leaf bases. It's similar to like a leek, I suppose, or an onion in that respect, just layers and layers of leaves. So you don't want to cut back too far into them and risk damaging it. So what I'll do, just keep chopping these off. Like that. I won't bore you really with showing the whole lot, but basically what we'll do, get the whole thing cleaned up. I generally do this around mid-March to mid-April time, something like that. And then when it actually comes to this main growing point here, you might be able to see from this distance, that leaf is actually quite brown and dried up. So one thing you might see where this happens is that the leaf can't actually open up. So I do this, it looks a bit brutal, but I basically just chop the whole thing off. And that then leaves that new roller plenty of room to grow out as soon as it needs to. But what I'll be doing over the next couple of weeks, because we're still in mid-March, this is a plant, again, like the Dwarf Cavendish, that is tender. So although it can take lower temperatures at the back end of the season, I don't want to put it outside while the soil's still cold. For me, there's no real advantage in getting your Ensete out early. That's something that I've had to change and evolve with over time. I used to put them out the second the last frost had finished, whether that seemed to be mid-April or the first week of May. But honestly, it just leads to a very stressful couple of weeks when there might be a really hard frost. The soil's cold, it's not going to grow anyway, and if anything, it might actually accelerate the rotting process. If that comes then sat in cold, wet soil after being inside lovely, warm and dry all winter, it's not a great recipe. So what I do now is basically tidy them up like this. I then give them a little bit of water, just a little bit every couple of weeks, literally a tiny amount, a few drips in the bottom of there, just to keep them ticking over and slowly push those new leaves up through the top of it. A little bit of hacking around later then, and this is what we're left with. So as you can see, definitely slimmed down, but this is the plant. I'm happy with the condition of it. I might just move out so that frond's not brushing my hair. This is the plant. I'm happy with how it looks. That definitely feels firm. You can see, if you look in the top very closely, there's definitely green or at least white of a new leaf ready to unfurl. So this is the plant, like I said, I'm going to water it every couple of weeks now until we get to maybe the first or second week of April. And at that point then, I'll probably bring it outside, give it another little tidy up, get rid of any of these loose leaf bases, any dry bits of leaf on it, and then I'll pot it into a slightly larger pot. And what I do then, I only put in something slightly bigger than this because there's no need wasting compost. It's only going to be a temporary measure. And what I'll do, put it back inside, but then you can start watering it a bit more. Because these roots in here, most of them currently will pretty much be dead, but they'll soon resprout new ones. They'll reach out into that new compost. With the extra water and a bit of feed, they grow in no time at all. Literally within a couple of weeks, the plant will start to fatten up a bit. The new rollers will easily be a metre tall from this plant. And at that point then, we'll be getting to late April, and then it's time to begin the hardening off process. And for this, it's pretty much exactly the same as the Dwarf Cavendish. I'll put them into the polytunnel, if I can fit them there height-wise, for a couple of days, maybe a few days, put them in there, and at that point, hopefully, we won't be far off having the last frost. Now, this is where things can get a bit tricky, because if the last frosts are in June, if you start your Ensetes too early, you're going to have a lot of leaf growth to cope with, so whether you've got them inside, if you're lucky enough to have a partner that lets you keep them in there, whether you've got them in your polytunnel or greenhouse, they will take up a lot of room. So that's one reason why I don't start them off completely in March, and I wait till the mid of April before I really get them going. But once you get these going, bring them outside, harden them off in the polytunnel. Once all risk of frost has passed for your area, like I said, that might be the first week of May, it might be early June, then it's time to plant them out. And these are a plant, you can plant them out in May time, maybe even June, with just a few small leaves. You give them plenty of water, plenty of feed, a good rich soil, and they will grow massively. It's a plant that can size up probably more than any other tropical style plant, and one that I wouldn't be without in my garden. So hopefully this quick video has helped you out. If you've got any other questions about growing these or any of the banana varieties I grow, then just drop me a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.